Hello. Thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be here.
Great to have you.
Thank you.
We want to hear from you about the Rebbe's approach and your experience to Bal Teshuva integration through his public addresses and through stories you've heard and your personal learning and experiences. By integration, we're talking about adjusting to religious life in a healthy way that translates into marriage, parenting, career, and also community life. We're interested in your perspective growing up, living, and teaching in Crown Heights, which is a long-time destination for Chabad Bal Teshuva.
So let's start with the basic question. To your knowledge, did the Rebbe ever publicly address Bal Teshuva as a group? And if not, why do you think perhaps the Rebbe might have chosen not to do so?
I'm going to allow myself to say something that you did not mention in your question at the outset, and then I'll get to your question. And that is, the Bal Teshuva were extraordinarily important to the Rebbe. They were deeply important to the Rebbe. The Rebbe loved them, he embraced them, he celebrated them, and I think in a very real way, the presence of the Bal Teshuva was, in the Rebbe's own mind, a measure of his own success. I'll tell you an incredible story that's well corroborated, that a while before the stroke, literally weeks or months prior to his stroke, the Rebbe was in his own room, and there was a Jew there whose name was Shalom Gansberg. He's Baruch Hashem alive and well. Shalom Gansberg was the closest thing to a family member that the Rebbe had. He lived in the Rebbe's house for many years. And even after the Rebbe's passed, he continued living in the Rebbe's house. And the Rebbe was pacing his room. The Rebbe was not much of a pacer. The Rebbe was pacing his room, and he said to himself, I was born on a Friday. People born on a Friday never finish what they start. What have I accomplished? Imagine the Rebbe said that in the winter of 92. He didn't say it to anybody in particular, but Shalom was there, and he felt like the Rebbe needs, something has to be said. So he told the Rebbe, how could the Rebbe say, what have I accomplished? The Rebbe made so many Bal Teshuva. And the Rebbe immediately said, yeah, that's true. And he was satisfied with that. So there is a book of Shalom Gansberg's recollections, which is called Bakodesh Pnima. It's a Hebrew book. And that book has notes of the former Rav of Chabad, Rav Mordechai Shmuel Ashkenazi, was a great Gaon and great scholar. And in the footnote on this story, he says that the third Lubavitcher Rebbe, whose name was Menachem Mendel also, the Tzemach Tzedek, asked a similar question as a rhetoric in the later years of his life. And the person there started giving all kinds of suggestions. You written many Chedushei Torah, you said a lot of Maimorim, and Tzemach Tzedek wasn't satisfied until this person said that Rebbe made many Bal Teshuva. And the Tzemach Tzedek said, yeah, that's true, I made many Bal Teshuva. The Alter Rebbe once said to his son, the Mittler Rebbe, the first Chabad Rebbe, said to his son, the second Chabad Rebbe, that you cannot compare me to my Rebbe meaning the Maggid of Mezrich. The Rebbe hat nicht gemacht kein Bal Teshuva. Ich hab doch gemacht Bal Teshuva. My Rebbe, the Mezritcher Maggid, was the Rebbe of Tzadikim. He made no Bal Teshuva. I made Bal Teshuva. And for the Rabbeim, the phenomenon of Bal Teshuva is incredibly deep and personally important. The tombstone of the Rebbe has far fewer words than the average tombstone of the average person. One of the few things written on the Matzeva is the words of Rabbim Heishem Yavin. He brought many people back from sin. The Rabbeim saw the idea of tshuva and the phenomena of the Bal Teshuva as personally deeply important to their mission. It was true of all the Rabbeim, and our Rebbe, who was the founder of the Tshuva movement, the father of the Tshuva movement. I can't tell you this as a matter of fact, but without saying it as a matter of fact, I can say it as a matter of fact. To him, the presence of the Bal Teshuva and people who turn their entire lives around, and as you are indicating in your question, figured out how to do it in a sustained way, not just go through this trip of becoming from and not being able to sustain it, but getting married and having children and become integrated in the community, was extremely near and dear to the Rebbe's heart. I grew up in the 70s. My father, was not a shliach, he was a professional, but my home was filled with these Bal Teshuva. As a child, My father was a sort of a rabbi in a shul, a community of Bal Teshuva. I grew up around them. I know the impact they had on me and my brother. And the place that they played in Crown Heights was, and do play continually, was very, very important. Very, very important to the Rebbe. There was a woman who once said to the Rebbe apologetically that she's not a descendant of Hasidic roots, and the Rebbe told her that I have two kinds of Hasidim. The Hasidim that I inherited from my father-in-law, and my own Hasidim. The Hasidim that I inherited from my father-in-law, the Hasidim whose parents were Hasidim, and my own Hasidim are the Bal Teshuva. Now, having said that, and I could speak more to this, but having said this, I understand from pretty strong evidence that the Rebbe, if it was up to him, would have integrated the Bal Teshuva into the community in the kind of way where they would not in any way be a distinctive demographic. The Rebbe did not want a separate Bal Teshuva shul. The Rebbe didn't even want separate Bal Teshuva schools. When the Bal Teshuva first appeared in our community, boys and girls, they went into regular yeshivas. How they integrated, when you look at it from today's perspective, seems kind of interesting. Perhaps they were quite intelligent, but they went into 770 and learned. And the girls went to Beis Rivka and learned. And within a year or two or three, you couldn't tell them apart from the so-called FFBs, from births. They integrated completely, they married, they became part of our community. And the first generation of Bal Teshuva, you don't even know them as Bal Teshuva. There was a Jew who's now deceased many years. His name was Kahas Weiss. He was a Bal Teshuva, and he married the daughter of a Kohen, which has all kinds of implications. And the girl's father asked the Rebbe about the worthiness, in quotations, of this, quote, Bal Teshuva marrying his daughter. And the Rebbe's response to him was, it's a very important question, but it has to be asked in reverse, does she deserve him? That's how the Rebbe answered the question. And if you knew Kahas Weiss, it was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. The Rebbe did not want a distinct Bal Teshuva community. And they backed the Rebbe into a Bal Teshuva yeshiva. When they first made the Bal Teshuva yeshiva in the 60s called Hadar HaTorah, the justification was that they made it in the women's section of 770, so that the Bal Teshuva boys were very close to the 770 boys. If the Rebbe would have had it his way, they would have never developed a distinct Bal Teshuva culture. The reality is that there is a distinct Bal Teshuva culture, the distinct Bal Teshuva schools and Bal Teshuva shuls, and I think that it has to do with our limitations. In other words, I don't think it's something that the Rebbe would have preferred. It happened because we, that means the Chabad family and community, were not, whatever the word is, embracing enough, open enough, or equipped enough, let's be kind, to completely integrate mass numbers of Bal Teshuva. When the Bal Teshuva movement was small, they integrated. But as the number of Bal Teshuva became more and more, and because of the differences between the Bal Teshuva background and the background of the regular yeshiva boys and girls, it became unreasonable, it became untenable, impractical to integrate them, so they became separate. So when you ask, why did the Rebbe not speak publicly about the demographic of Bal Teshuva, the Rebbe was completely colorblind. There was no such thing as a Bal Teshuva in his mind. They were from Jews. They were Jews, period. A cute story to support this, that there's a Jew who I know, whose name is Hillel Zaltzman, Rabbi Hillel Zaltzman. He published the book Samarkand, which is a very important read. Yeah. And he told me a story, I think it's in his book, but he told it to me that in the late 60s, early 70s, in the city of Samarkand, they made a cheder. Under the nose of the Soviets, kids would come after school and learn Torah every day of the week. Now, of course, there wasn't a lot of children gathering in one place and buses, two or three children in one house. It was all done very clandestinely, very quietly. But at their peak, they had 500 children in the Soviet Union in the early 1970s studying Torah each day. And they had a question that the more expansive this project becomes, the more difficult it is to sustain secrecy, and secrecy was paramount. If the government finds out about it, they shut it all down and they send people to Siberia. And one of the questions that they had were that they were involved with what's called Anash, the children of Hasidim, and there was the Bukharian Jews, the Asian Jews who lived in Samarkand, and the question was whether they should risk incorporating those children into the school because of fear of exposure. So there was a Yid, he told me the story directly, I heard from him personally, whose name was Moishe Nislevich, who was a Yid Tzaddik, very holy Jew, very special man. And they agreed that when he would leave Russia, he would go and see the Rebbe. And he would send them a message. And the message would say that if the Rebbe approved of incorporating the Bukharian children, so then that the Rebbe preferred the red shoes. And if the Rebbe preferred not to incorporate the Bukharian children, they would say that the Rebbe preferred the black shoes. Anyway, he left Russia and he sent them a telegram a while later. He says, I asked the grandfather about the shoes. He says he doesn't understand the difference between one pair and the other. That was the answer. And that's typical, that's classic. The Rebbe wanted Anash, us, to literally integrate Bal Teshuva into our community as if they are equal and the same as us. And today in Lubavitch, among second generation of Bal Teshuva, there's an enormous amount of intermarriage. You don't even know who's a child of Bal Teshuva anymore, and I think this is how the Rebbe would have wanted it. In a perfect world, the interface between the traditional Anash and the Bal Teshuva would have made everybody better. The Bal Teshuva would have been better because they were around people who knew custom and tradition, especially about such things as home and family and relationships. And the Anash would have been better because they're around Jews who are so inspired. I would say that to some extent this has become difficult because of our own limitations, and we're poorer for it. We're poorer for it, and the Bal Teshuva are poorer for it.
Do you think it became more difficult because the later generations of Bal Teshuva were older when they joined in, so no longer could they join Beis Rivka? They needed a post-seminary or a seminary experience. Could they have gotten to Beis Rivka seminary even at 27 or 28?
First of all, I don't necessarily think that the time when people did tshuva determines the age at which they joined. For boys, this is much less of a problem because the boys tend to learn older, and the structure of the learning is not so classroom-based. So if a man who's 40 is learning with a boy who's 20, it's not that big an issue because it's a study partnership. It's two people studying together. I personally feel that it was a lack of acceptance. It was a lack of sincerity. You see, the Rebbe wanted every Lubavitcher Chassid to be him, which means that we should be completely dedicated to embracing the Bal Teshuva and bringing them into our homes. And some were, and some were not. For some it was easier, for some it was more difficult, for all kinds of reasons. And I think the end game was that the people who were directly involved in the Bal Teshuva movement, that means the rabbis and the rebbitzins, just felt that it was a great idea, but it was just not a practical one. It wasn't going to work. It's unfortunate. It really is unfortunate. I know that it's unfortunate because I watched the evolution. I think today, for example, if you had a sprinkling of Bal Teshuva in our yeshivas, the traditional boys and girls would be much more inspired simply seeing people who are so inspired to learn Torah and do mitzvahs. But with rare exception, there are exceptions. There are boys who join the regular yeshivas, and there are girls who join the regular schools, particularly if they become frum at a very young age. It doesn't work.
I'm curious to ask because I think your answer beautifully explained why the Rebbe wouldn't single Bal Teshuva out or address them publicly as a group. But I wonder what your impression is in terms of private guidance, meetings with Bal Teshuva, individuals who might have had specific issues that are perhaps not unique to, but especially common among or difficult for Bal Teshuva to handle. Did the Rebbe give a particular kind of guidance or message to those who were building a life inside the Anash community, but not, children of Hasidim themselves?
As a rule, the Rebbe gave personal advice, period. And the advice that you got from the Rebbe was often based on the advice that you sought, based on the questions that you asked. Many people, for various reasons, were either embarrassed or afraid or not clear enough to come forward and ask the Rebbe direct questions. But if you asked the Rebbe a direct question, you got a direct answer, and it was simply a reflection of who you were. In other words, the Rebbe's perspective is so pristine that I don't even think in his own mind there was an issue. FFBs, from birth, so-called Anash, they got stuff. And one thing you didn't do is lie to the Rebbe. You could lie to me, you could lie to you, you could lie to your neighbor. You didn't lie to the Rebbe. So the Rebbe got the straight story, and you can almost say that every chassid went into the Rebbe as a Bal Teshuva. You didn't go in and put on your pretty face. You went in and were honest. And you were addressed and responded to with that measure of honesty. And the Rebbe was extremely individual. And his advice was very, very sensitive and very, very wise and very, very practical. I just a little anecdote of a person who went into the Rebbe and told the Rebbe, "You taught me how to stand or fly, now teach me how to sit down," meaning teach me how, and the Rebbe spent 45 minutes with him, helping him figure out how to integrate his tshuva into regular living. It was very important to the Rebbe, and at some point it became impossible for the Rebbe to meet people in private, so he would continue answering people's questions in writing, but the Rebbe very much depended on us, the Chassidim, the Mashpiyim, and the Bal Teshuva from the earlier generations, from the 60s and the early 70s, when the Rebbe did meet people in private, to compensate for his lack of availability to the younger generations of Bal Teshuva, and it's true to this very day.
One of the questions we've asked ourselves and others is, where is all of this advice and guidance, whether it's from the Rebbe or from the Bal Teshuva themselves? Where can we find it? And why doesn't it exist in one book somewhere in the Sefer?
Well, that's a great question, but if you go to Gem and you watch their encounters, there are scores of Bal Teshuva telling their stories. When you watch people describe their meetings with the Rebbe, you forget that they're Bal Teshuva. I'm telling you, the Rebbe's angle to people was so transcendent that you don't realize to what extent the interviews of Gem are being done to people who are Bal Teshuva. Go back and watch many interviews, and you'll see example after example after example of people who were joining the community or who was contemplating joining the community, and the Rebbe addresses them very individually, very, very personally. But somehow it was so uplifting that you don't always hear the extent of the struggle, but there are so many examples of that. You want a record? Check it out. Go to Gem. I don't know how you access their archive, but watch the Maya encounters. There's probably 100 or more of meetings between the Rebbe and Bal Teshuva, and the Rebbe is giving them advice, teaching them how to live their lives, how to integrate into the mainstream of the community, and how to sustain themselves as Jewish people. There's so much of it, and maybe it's a good idea to compile it as a Bal Teshuva handbook, as common sense advice. People talk about how holy the Rebbe is and how many miracles he performed. But people don't know that for the first 25 years of his leadership, when the Rebbe met people in private, most of what he dispensed of was pashut, common sense wisdom. He was talking to a generation of Jews who had come from the Holocaust and come from the Nazis. You didn't have to be a Bal Teshuva to be confused and broken, trust me. And the Rebbe gave each person time and wisdom of life. Part of the tragedy is that not enough of this recorded because we don't seem to appreciate just how valuable it is. But there's so much of that. So much. There's thousands of hours of the Rebbe's time where the Rebbe sat and gave people common sense advice. Literally common sense advice. And it's out there in nuggets on Gem. And if you can get hold of the first generation of Bal Teshuva, that means the people who are from the 60s and 70s, and get a hold of the raw footage of their interviews from Gem, you got hours of it. Gem puts up 3 minutes, 4 minutes, 5 minutes, but each one of those people spoke for 2 or 3 hours. There's so much, if you know how to compile it, available. It's so important. I agree with you. It's a project that maybe you should consider pursuing. Find a Bal Teshuva on a Gem, get a hold of him and say, can I get the whole video? Because that wisdom is really important. And that's what it is. It's teaching people how to live as Jews.
Very true. know if the Bal Teshuva of the 60s and 70s had this, but you do hear stories later on about dysfunction and Bal Teshuva who don't fit in, and their kids who are quote unquote second-class citizens. Do you think it was because they weren't able to get the Rebbe's advice that they had this difficulty integrating? And what advice would you give, based on your learning, to help people who are just not fitting in and not functioning to really fully step into from life?
I'm going to step out of mold. Which question are you now asking me?
I made that one up.
Oh, okay, fine, fair enough. I noticed that I read the paper. You see, dysfunction is not a Bal Teshuva property. There is a great increase in social dysfunction across the board. Bal Teshuva, FFB, there are many reasons why there's a huge increase in dysfunction. Some people say it's the physical lack of the Rebbe's presence which is responsible for dysfunction. Others will say, and I'm one of those others, that the world has become so much crazier than it was, that the dysfunction has seeped into our community. You have kids raised in the best of homes who have the same problem that Bal Teshuva have in literally figuring out how to be married and how to bring children into this world and how to raise them. Things that 50 years ago, whether you were from or not from, you went to public school, you got a traditional education. It taught you. I have my Machon, my son's father-in-law is a Bal Teshuva. He's a doctor. And he said to me, I went to public school in Montreal in the 50s and 60s. He says, I got a wholesome education in a public school. The public schools are not the same. You can't send a kid to a public school today. They're going to be raised with madness. They're going to be raised with ideas that are such distortions of what humanity is. So this isn't a Bal Teshuva issue. It's a generational issue that has to do with the world and the extent to which that world has seeped into our world. I would agree with you that Bal Teshuva, because they're coming from that world, would probably suffer from these ills on a higher percentage. But by no means is this a Bal Teshuva issue. By no means is it a Bal Teshuva issue. This is a generational issue where parents don't have a proper and a balanced philosophy about child rearing. It's upsetting. It's tragic. And some of them don't have that sense because they themselves didn't get it. And others don't have that sense because they're rebelling against the values that they were given, or because they felt that the way they were raised was too punitive and too draconian, whatever the case is. And they don't have a good philosophy of child rearing. And if you don't raise your children, you're going to have dysfunction.
So one theme that we often explore...
Can you give me a moment,
just
to think for a second, if you don't mind?
Of course.
I have students at this point for 35 years, close to 35 years. And when I first started out as a teacher, I had students who are now my friends, who were the children of Bal Teshuva, and they would tell me that when they went to our schools, they felt second class. And then a few years later, those same students came back to me and said, my younger sisters told me that they don't feel that anymore. It was a long time ago. Lubavitch became so pluralistic, became such a, so to speak, integrated community, or a more even distribution of so-called Anash versus Bal Teshuva, that if you go into our schools, you will never be able to tell who's the child of the Bal Teshuva, who's the child of the member of Anash, not in terms of his academics, not in terms of his Chassidishkeit, and not in terms of his social standing. So to answer your question directly, from my perspective, now I could be wrong, the problem you described of them feeling second class was far truer, at least in their own minds. And these are my kids, my students, 40 years ago and 30 years ago than it is today. The dysfunction that they feel now is not because they're Bal Teshuva, it's because there's dysfunction. And the dysfunction is not specific to one demographic or another at all.
One dynamic that we talk about a lot is how issues that deals with to some extent, whether it's shalom bias or emotional issues, mental health, financial stress, fitting into a community. Those aren't only issues that affect Bal Teshuva, but because Bal Teshuva make this great transition in life and sometimes feel, probably wrongly, that they have to sever ties with the past, with their own family members, with their friends, with a part of themselves. Sometimes those issues can take on a greater life of their own, or not have the same sort of support structure to keep them in place. And so I'm wondering whether you ever saw or understood the Rebbe to respond to those sorts of issues, the structural support issues of Bal Teshuva who didn't have the kind of intergenerational family behind them in Crown Heights, wherever they lived, to help them accommodate to life's challenges.
First of all, I agree with what you said, and I would take it one step further. It's not only that a lot of them choose to dissociate from their so-called former families, which is a big tragedy, but because very, very often, especially as time passes, in other words, they get closer and closer to today, the American family is bankrupt. In other words, these children are not raised in normal secular homes. Raising a child is raising a child. Teaching him decency, teaching him loyalty, responsibility, fidelity, honesty. If you grew up in a secular home, but there's a husband, a father, and a mother who love each other and respect each other and impart values about relationships, those lessons apply in a frum community as they would apply any place else. And Bal Teshuva from that background will have a far easier time integrating. So in other words, I don't only think it's because they're divorcing their past, it's because there isn't a past to fall back on. And I'm going to tell you again that as time passes, this becomes more and more an anash issue. There's more and more anash who either choose to or just don't know how to live a normal life. And it certainly is a pressure which is distinct on Bal Teshuva. There's no question that the hardest part about being a Bal Teshuva is not having family. There's no question about it. The hardest thing is that you do everything yourself. My wife had a baby. She went to stay with her mother. If you're a Bal Teshuva couple, unless you have special parents, you're on your own. And some do. I've seen them come into the community, but most don't. And this is the hardest thing. I remember speaking to a man many, many years ago who told me, we became frum, we didn't have our own family, so we created an artificial family, meaning to say that because they had gone to yeshiva together, Misadara Torah and Machon Chana, the children were cousins, not biologically, but socially, because they were part of the same generation of Bal Teshuva. As I said to you in my introduction, I cannot candidly, honestly tell you that I know of a case where the Rebbe addressed this question. My understanding is that the Rebbe expected us to embrace the Bal Teshuva, incorporate them in our community, and make it our business to help them figure these things out. Unfortunately, for every family in Crown Heights that does this, there are 10 or 20 or 30 or 50 that don't, including families of former Bal Teshuva. In a perfect world, a couple that gets married, doesn't have parents, needs to be adopted by a local family. And everything has to be taught. How to make a kosher kitchen, how to prepare meals for many people, how to balance laundry and meals and keeping the house clean and looking after the children. I mean, the burdens of a frum life are extraordinary. There's so much more that you need to do. And to figure all of that out, you need wisdom and practical advice. Again, I go back to my initial point. The Rebbe did not want Bal Teshuva to be a separate community, and he expected us to support the Bal Teshuva. On some levels we do, on some levels we don't. I would argue that there's two classes of Bal Teshuva, and this is not unique to Bal Teshuva, but it's especially acute when it comes to Bal Teshuva. The Bal Teshuva who never give up on their mashpiyim. Bal Teshuva get married, they'll always go back to their teachers. Not necessarily the teachers who taught them Torah, but the teachers who will teach them how you build a home, how you establish a relationship with your wife, how you raise children. And then there are Bal Teshuva, for whatever reasons, who are, forgive me for using this word, who are orphaned. And it's very difficult. It's tragic. It's very, very difficult for them. And they need to ask for help. And if they find a couple, a family, that takes a liking to them, that's prepared to sort of include them as a surrogate child, they should take that opportunity. They shouldn't feel like they're intruding on other people. They shouldn't feel like the other people are patronizing them. Everybody needs support. And Bal Teshuva in many cases don't have it. It's the hardest part of being a Bal Teshuva. You know, when we got married, I needed advice. I spoke to my father. My wife needed advice. She spoke to her, whatever it is, her sister, her mother, whatever the case is. Bal Teshuva don't have that support, and they need to get it from the community. It's very much an individual thing. It's not like there's a social structure that provides this, and not that there should be a social structure. It's very private. But in a perfect Crown Heights and in a perfect New Haven, every Bal Teshuva couple is very lovingly and tenderly and without condescension embraced by a family, perhaps a family whose children are already grown, and they literally teach them how to build a Jewish life. It was that way in the beginning. I can tell you that as a fact. It was that way in the beginning. My wife's grandmother, his name was Mrs. Schusterman, Henya Schusterman. The number of Bal Teshuva that came through her home and the way she embraced them, and she literally raised young couples, one after another, and she taught them on the woman's end how to be Bal Teshuva, how to live. My parents' home was open as a child. So many people came through, and many of the people who came through were repeat come-throughers. In other words, they became a part of our extended family. But there's a need for more. There's a need for a lot more of that. I hope that answers the question practically. And if you're looking for initiatives, this is a great initiative to undertake. No one wants to talk about it because the Bal Teshuva don't want to feel like they're being patronized or being done a favor to. But there's enough seniors in this neighborhood, enough couples who are in their early 60s, whose children are married, they're out of the house, who are very capable of embracing a couple, two couples, and literally having them at their Shabbos table and just helping them get off the ground and being there when they run into pitfalls in school and in PTA and with the principals and with tuition and with parnasa and with shalom bayis. This is what the Rebbe wants. He never told me, but there's no doubt in my mind. This is how the Rebbe sees it.
Well, we've definitely been the benefactors of the Schusterman legacy, both in your home and also through your relatives, the Graviches.
Right, but you see, but many people, they don't have it, and the tragedy is many people are afraid to solicit it. They're afraid to ask for it, and they need to. It's important. The Bal Teshuva couple feels abandoned. They need to just need one family. That's all it is. And don't feel like, oh, well, I don't want to take advantage of them. No, this is very important. And in the cases where this works, the senior couple that embraces this, they're like a Zayd and a Baba to the Einiklach. It's a very real possibility, and it can be done so tastefully and so kindly and so generously if the people involved are mentioned. But too many Bal Teshuva feel that they're going to be seen as dependent. And they are. they are dependent. But when you need something, you have to ask for it. This is critically important.
Well, that was part of the pushback we've gotten, is people saying we don't want FFBs to come in and tell us what to do.
You don't want FFB. You want to choose the FFB. You want to select the FFB that you feel comfortable with to help you figure life out. You know, you've been in different homes. Yeah? If there's a home that you visit that you like, become repeat guests. And when there's discussions, be candid and allow that relationship to develop. And if the people you're meeting, it's not always the case. I mean, oftentimes the FFBs don't want to be that generous, and that hurts. That hurts terribly when you open yourself up and you're vulnerable and then you get pushed back. But when you see a family that's prepared to give of themselves more to you, take it. The FFB shouldn't be making this decision. The Bal Teshuva should be making this decision.
What would you say to the Bal Teshuva who've been orphaned, so to speak, and now they're starting to look outside of Chabad because they feel, well, if yeshiva and seminary, they're not taking care of me anymore, and I can't find the right people. Maybe this isn't the right path of Judaism for me. Maybe I have to look elsewhere.
Well, it's a possibility. It really is a possibility. I mean, maybe that's not the answer you're expecting me to give, but it's got to work. It has to work. And if Chabad doesn't work for you, there's probably more factors than this. If you can find a community that embraces you, that there's a rabbi that understands you and gives you the time of day, and the community is supportive, and the schools are supportive, absolutely go there. I believe, above all else, that everybody, including a Bal Teshuva, needs one philosophy of life. If you choose to join a different community, you really need to integrate in that community. You can't be a nasher. You know, as an individual, as an intellectual, you can study this and study that and study the other thing. But as a philosophy of life, you need to belong to a community. And if you find a community that works for you, then that's absolutely where you should go. I believe. So it's my most important statement is you have to choose one path and make it work for you. But I do believe that there's many places, maybe not in New York, but in many places, Crown Heights is a mix of the best in the world and the most difficult. It's very hard. Crown Heights is a very, very hard place. If you make it here, it's an incredible place to raise children. If it doesn't work for you, there are smaller communities. You can move to Chicago. Within Chabad. You can move to New Haven. A lot of people are moving to New Haven. You can move to Philadelphia. You could move to Montreal. You could move to Houston, Texas. You could move to Atlanta. There's many places where people are now moving. You can move to the 5 towns. People are moving to different places because they want to belong to a community. They want to be supported by a rabbi and by a rebbitzin and these other things. It has to work for you. And you can't wait for a miracle to happen. You need to seek it out. You have to look for it, and you have to try and find it. I think there is so much within Chabad if people seek properly. You know, when I was growing up as a child, I remember that the best of the Bal Teshuva that I knew, you're talking now 1970s, 45 years ago, emigrated to Israel. They felt that in Israel, where the spoken language is Hebrew, their children are going to have an easier time integrating. And it's true. It's simply true. They moved to Israel, and their children are indistinguished members of the community. Hebrew is their first language. They didn't struggle with the difficulty of language in school because their parents couldn't help them with homework because it was the spoken tongue and so on and so forth. This was a big sin, they're leaving the Rebbe to go to Eretz Yisrael, and they didn't do it for shlichus. They did it because they felt that's the best way they can make their Jewish life work. The one thing you're not allowed to do is stay where you are and not find community and support and say, I'm an orphan. You need to take steps to make it work for you. And like I said, Philadelphia is a beautiful community. A lot of Bal Teshuva are moving there. It's a small, with a beautiful school system. And there are other places. I mean, I don't want to advertise one over the other because I can get into trouble. A, why am I favoring one or the other? B, we have enough kids in our school. We don't need any more, But there are places that people could move to find communities. There's in Pennsylvania, Kingston. Yeah, it's got several hundred families of Menashe. There's a boys' school and a girls' school. You can move there. You can have support, but you can't leave it alone. You can't just accept the fact that you're in a large community, and I'm sorry to use these words, and nobody sees you. It's too important. It's too important. And Bal Teshuva should seek the help of other Bal Teshuva. They should really seek the help of the mashpiyim, and they should be supported. And if they don't feel supported, they should go to a place where they are supported. I'm going to tell you a really, really blasphemous thing, a terribly sinful thing, but I observed this with my own eyes. The best place for a Bal Teshuva, especially if they became Bal Teshuva older, to raise their children is in the Chabad house where they were made from. Because nobody is going to look after them the way that Rabbi and Rebbitzin will. The shliach who made them from is their father. And they get the best chance. Maybe they won't be as frum, but their children are going to get the best chance at not feeling abandoned. And they move to the big city and nobody knows them and they just expect this community to embrace them. It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. You have to assert yourself. You need to take steps to be noticed and to become part of a community. And if it doesn't work here, you go to where it will work. I mean, these are very sensitive issues, but they're incredibly important. And I'm trying to be candid because I guess that's the point of this interview, that I should be candid.
Absolutely. I wanted to come back to your point about, the Rebbe's wish that every family in Crown Heights, and I take it every family everywhere, whether an Anash family or a Bal Teshuva family, would take a new Bal Teshuva couple under their wing.
I didn't say that the Rebbe said it. I said that it's in the spirit of the Rebbe. The Rebbe would complain to us when he saw neglect. He felt that it was our responsibility, but he never said it in precisely those words. It's very important. If we're quoting the Rebbe, we have to quote, we cannot exaggerate what the Rebbe said, but this is the spirit of it. There's no question that's the spirit, but he never said it in this many words. He wouldn't. You know why he wouldn't? I don't think the Rebbe ever identified the Bal Teshuva community publicly as a separate demographic, ever, because it went against his basic philosophy. So if people were neglected, he would cry, he would scream and say, "What's this?" But he would never identify them as Bal Teshuva. He would just simply identify people who need support and help.
I was wondering how you'd respond to a family that says, look, it's hard enough as it is to be frum today, to raise frum children today for all the reasons you've mentioned, the societal challenges, the financial stress, and some people didn't choose to go on lyhadus. They are living in a community, and how would you respond to them if they said, we feel it's just one too many things to ask, that we would make our own house into a community Chabad house?
Oh, the answer to that question is there are enough people whose children are out of the house. There are enough people who are in a position to do this without extra stress. I mean, I'm a teacher. My wife's a teacher, so we always had the people over. But trust me, there are so many. In New Haven, there are enough seniors who, if they were mobilized, they need to have seichel. Not everybody has seichel. Some people are, forgive me, you can be a 60-year-old and be an idiot. But there are enough people who don't have all those burdens, who, if they were encouraged, would do it. And they would do it tastefully and tactfully. It's simply a question of a shadchan, of somebody it has to be done very secretly, very respectfully, and very tactfully. Organize it. In this neighborhood, I mean, my parents are elderly, but 10 years ago, I know Bal Teshuva who grew up in our home. The 14-year-old boy came from out of town. Every time he stayed in our house. My parents walked him to the chuppah, didn't walk him to the chuppah, but literally raised them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And of course, they're literally their children in their way, and they feel that way towards my parents. And my parents were very special, but they weren't unique. It's a question of finding those people and saying, listen, this couple, they really need this support. Invite them, and invite them again, and invite them again. And if it's done properly, they don't even have to realize that someone is arranging for them a surrogate family. But the Bal Teshuva have to let it happen. I feel too many of the Bal Teshuva don't want to feel that needy and dependent, and they're making a mistake. It's too important, and it's so out of love. It's so coming from a good place. They should be very happy to be embraced. And then you can go to them for Pesach, and you go to them for Sukkot, and they help you with your children's chinuch. Whether they actually tutor your children or they give you advice when it comes to schools, Bal Teshuva come into the schools, they don't understand the culture, they don't know how to negotiate, they run into brick walls, they get into so much trouble, and their little wisdom from somebody who understands how the system works will save them such extraordinary heartache, and most importantly, such extraordinary suffering of their children. But they need to seek it out. For the Bal Teshuva side, they have to allow it to happen. From the Anash side, they have to take responsibility. And from the Shadchan side, they have to be unbelievably sensitive, not to make anybody feel like they're being put in a position of being inferior.
Do you feel that the community learned lessons from the challenges faced by the earlier waves of Bal Teshuva?
The community has become more accepting of Bal Teshuva. The community has become less condescending towards the Bal Teshuva. To make a shidduch today with the children of Bal Teshuva is not even an issue. Not at all. For a frum boy or girl to marry a Bal Teshuva is almost a non-issue. So in this way, we've learned lessons. But in terms of concerning ourselves with them, I think it was individuals who did it then, and it's individuals who are doing it now. There's a lot of individuals, but that's what it is. It's people who are real Lubavitchers, who know what the Rebbe is about, and they're prepared to open their hearts and their homes and include these people in their families. Some people got it, some people don't got it. It's just the way it is, and I don't know if any lessons were learned as far as that's concerned. In other words, it's not like people who 50 years ago thought it was a bad idea, today think it's a good idea. I think it's individual. It was individual then, it's individual now. You have to remember, if you're bringing Bal Teshuva into your home, your role is to teach them how to be Jewish, not how to be chilled. You know what I'm saying? It's you yourself have to represent Yiddishkeit in a wholesome way, in a way that this is the most important thing for you.
What advice would you give to people today who are stepping into that role and hosting Bal Teshuva? What kinds of things should you talk about at the Shabbos table? What questions should you ask? Should you step in if you feel like there's something amiss, or stand back and give someone distance and time? Do you have any advice for someone in that situation?
Well, every question like that is entirely individual. The most important thing is to be generous and kind, and not chas v'sholem make that person feel like you're doing them a favor. You really need to do this with your whole heart. I was reading Rabbi Sarabransky was the Rebbe Shliach from 1949 to Australia. He was a tzaddik. He was mamish a very big chassid. He was a chassid from Lubavitch. And the Bal Teshuva started coming around, and a man told me that he knocked on his door and he said, "Can I talk to you?" And he said, "Sure." He says, "I'm sorry, I'm wasting your time." He says, No. Every minute you spend with me, you're giving me more time." And he spent with him several hours talking about what he was learning. And then when the man was leaving, he apologized again. He says, "Every minute you spend with me gives me more time." He meant it. You see, that's the issue. The people who do this have to be doing it with such generosity. And you're dealing with adult people with their own minds, and you cannot make them feel like a dependent class. That's the most important message you could give to the members of Anash. Now, in terms of mixing in, it all depends on what the people you're involved with are prepared to hear. The truth is, they should mix in a lot. They should mix in constantly. But they can only do that if they really have seichel, and they're not just meddlers, but they're trying to help, and B, if the people they're talking to want to hear it. Because everybody needs advice. And getting married's hard. I tell my students that being married is harder than raising kids. And raising kids is very hard. Everybody needs advice. And in a perfect world, people get that advice from the people closest to themselves. You go to therapy and read books, you get it from your father and your mother. If you can't get it from your biological father and your mother, you get it from your spiritual father and your mother. And the relationship should be so tender and so gentle that the advice should be able to be given. Oftentimes, the people mix into couples' problems, they exacerbate and make them worse. They take a side and they make the fight worse. And in that case, they have no business being in this business. The role of the support is to defuse these kinds of situations. But if you have that much seichel, you absolutely should mix in. But you can only mix in if you're certain that the people you're trying to help want you to mix in. Otherwise, you need to back off. So every case is different. And the Bal Teshuva should be able to take that counsel on advisement, be able to think about it. And it works. I'm telling you, there's many examples of this, where Bal Teshuva learn the traditional values of home and family from people that they're close to, and they do as well or better as the people who taught them, because they allow themselves to learn those lessons. And that's what this is. This is life. But you have to be open to it.
I just want to go back to my previous question. Do you think that the Bal Teshuva community has learned from the challenges that the earlier Bal Teshuva made? And if so, is there sort of an oral tradition that's been passed down? Where can we access all this wisdom of the people who've already done all the things that we're about to step into on our own journey?
Well, you have to find them, right? The Bal Teshuva who have been here for 50 years exist, and they're alive. You may not even know who they are, right? And you can go and seek their counsel. I would say the biggest change in our community is that we've become a far more modern community across the board. And this is very confusing to Bal Teshuva because they're making so many sacrifices to become frum, and they're getting so many different messages because there's so many different standards. In the 70s, there were not that many standards. It was simpler. The frum community was simpler. And the people were very devout, and you joined this community and you became devout like them. This is very confusing to Bal Teshuva. It's very hard. So, talking about learning lessons, these are new problems. These are new challenges. But you're asking about seeking advice from the first generation of Bal Teshuva. Would you know that Mrs. Pape and Rabbi Pape are Bal Teshuva? Would it cross your mind? Well, there's a resource, and there are scores of them. Of that generation who still had lyhadus with the Rebbe. They're alive and well, and they're prepared to give counsel if you'll ask. I don't have to say names of people on this forum, but there are so many people who've been through that journey who would be happy to assist. You have to just seek them out, and if you can organize this and create some kind of a manual or a guide, that will be incredibly helpful. But it still comes down to people, and it still comes down to choices, and it still comes down to dedication, to hard work.
I guess because we've lived out of town our whole marriage. We didn't have that chance to meet the BTs of Crown Heights.
Yeah, but you got plenty of BTs where you are, trust me.
Yeah, no, it's true. We actually started something amongst the women to meet. But yeah, maybe we can encourage more people to do that.
And the point is the Rebbe doesn't want to create two communities, but to gather this wisdom from the earlier generation. There's a man I know who I just love him. I've known him since my childhood. Him and his wife sort of have lived their own life. They're not really part of any community. And their children are all grown and married, and now they have grandchildren. And I was at a bar mitzvah of one of his grandchildren, and all of his sons came with all of their children, and I turned to him and said, "Your grandchildren have cousins." And he almost cried. You know how hard it was for him, how hard it was for his children. He's a very beautiful person, and he's so focused on Yiddishkeit. He became frum for a reason, and he didn't forget that, and he tried to communicate that to his children. But he was very alone. And his children's children are not alone. They have each other. And that's how this program is supposed to work. And in the generation before, they're supposed to be surrogate cousins. And like I said, in a perfect world, it could and should work. But it's complicated.
In closing, I want to ask you a question we ask all of our guests, which is, what's the top piece of advice that you'd like to give to every Bal Teshuva living today? It's advice that I wouldn't only give to Bal Teshuva, it's advice that I would give to everybody in all facets of life. I'm only going to say the positive, I'm not going to say the negative. I think the negative is self-explanatory, so I'm just going to skip it. A Jewish home is supposed to be a normal, orderly, predictable, peaceful place. A Jewish school is supposed to be a normal, orderly, peaceful place. And this is what you want to create. Rah is not a way of life. Harmony and peace, cleanliness, schedule, order, this is how people live. Now, if you grew up as an only child, or if you grew up with one parent, you don't know those values. And when you get married, it becomes very, very difficult to create values that are not part of your psychological DNA, but you need to work very hard together with your partner in creating your home to be peaceful. The kids go to sleep on time, they get up on time,
Not everybody is the good housekeeping, but the home has to be clean and orderly. And things have to have a place. And there has to be respect. Normal. All the passion and the holiness of Chassidus is effective and sustainable on that foundation. And I think it's the most important piece of advice you can tell anybody. You're getting married. It's not about the excitement. It's about the consistency and the order. In that environment, there's peace and there's security, and people can grow up and become people themselves. And be very careful not to view your way of life as a chassid as hyper or hysterical, because in yeshiva that was the message you got. If you got that message in yeshiva, it was wrong there also. But in yeshiva, there's room for it. But a home and a classroom for little children is not a Bal Teshuva yeshiva. It's not. And it needs to be peaceful and orderly and predictable and together. And another piece of advice that I would offer, I want to remind every Bal Teshuva who's raising children that there are two of you. There's him and her. And you need to spend whatever time needed to figure these things out. You have to talk them over and make a plan. And when one has a strength that the other one has, in that area they take the lead. And the other one has a strength the former doesn't have. In that area that you have to work, you have to spend the time. Obviously, the most important thing in a marriage is becoming a couple. You know, the cliche is you can't just love each other, you have to actually like each other. You have to work together. And if you disagree, you have to work those disagreements out and work together as a couple. Everything you do in your married life, especially as it relates to your children, has to be done together, because that two people carrying this burden doesn't lighten the load by half. It lightens the load by 9/10. And your husband is obnoxious and he's immature, or your wife is controlling and she treats you like she's your mother. Those are excuses. You get past those things, and you work as a couple towards, first of all, being a couple, giving each other, one of the most important things that every couple needs to know, that your wife doesn't need what you think she needs. Your wife needs what she thinks she needs. And when she asks you for something, don't decide that it means what you want it to mean. You give her what she needs. Your husband doesn't need what you think your husband needs. Your husband needs what he asked you for, and your role is to provide him with what he needs, not what you think he needs. But this is true in the personal relationship. And then you navigate and negotiate this slowly. It takes a very long time to become a couple. It takes years and years and years and years. And do not ever forsake that responsibility for anything, even for your children. The greatest thing any couple could do for their children is love and respect one another. It's a simple fact. And as hard as it is, if you spend the time working through whatever it is and becoming a couple, and of course, there's nothing in the world more beautiful or more meaningful or more wholesome and more lasting than love that's based on respect and mutual living. That is the foundation on which you're going to raise healthy children. And it's not a particularly religious thing. People raised in secular homes, if they had such parents, they're so far ahead of the game. When they become frum, they almost don't have to learn how to live. They know. Because this is basically being a human being. And unfortunately, in the culture that we live in, because family has been so destroyed, an incredibly high percentage of people never saw this. And every day this becomes more an issue in the frum community, because we are affected by our environment. And the children who are mature have to relearn lessons, that their grandparents took for granted in some cases. And that's, I guess I said two things. Number one, that it has to be normal. And number two, that you really have to do everything you can to be a couple.
Rabbi Paltiel is a sought-after teacher and mentor, and the founder of InsideChassidus.org. Thank you for joining us, Rabbi Paltiel.
I feel that this is incredibly important, and you gave me opportunity to say things that I feel very deeply about. And if I have other opportunities to share, I would be very happy to do this again.
How's your schedule tomorrow?
Not this week, my friend. After Gimel Tammuz, I'm
kidding.
inundated.
We really loved it, and we'd love to have you back.
Of course, my pleasure. My pleasure.
Maybe we could convince Mrs. Paltiel to come on.
Oh, that would be. So you have to call her. You have to call her.
We'd love to.
Okay, chazak. Take care of yourselves. And Kol Tov. I want you to know that the credit for this podcast goes to Sarah. I never have done this before. And I said to Sarah, should I do this? She said, of course you should do it. So here we are. I did it.